I never believed in karma until that moment at the altar, when everything I thought I knew about my life crumbled with just one whisper. My name is Lysander Demetrios Kalogeris, and 6 months ago, I was untouchable. I was a god among mortals. On the Greek island of Mykonos, heir to a hotel empire worth hundreds of millions, living a life most people only dream about. But standing there in that ancient Orthodox church, with the scent of burning incense mixing with the salt air drifting through stained glass windows, I learned that sometimes the people you think are beneath you are actually the ones holding all the power. The morning sun was casting golden rays across the white marble floors when Melania leaned close to me, her lips barely brushing my ear. The priest was speaking in ancient Greek, his voice echoing off the stone walls, but all I could hear was the thundering of my own heartbeat as she whispered those words that would destroy everything I believed about myself, about my family, about the very foundation of our wealth. I know what your father did to my family in 1995. I know how you really got rich. The wedding bouquet of white roses and baby's breath fell from her trembling hands, hitting the marble with a soft thud that seemed to echo like thunder in my ears. 300 guests sat behind us, politicians, business moguls, celebrities who had flown in from across Europe. But in that moment, it felt like the whole world had gone silent, except for those devastating words spinning in my head. But let me take you back to where this nightmare really began, 6 months earlier, when I was still convinced I was the master of my own destiny. It was a scorching July evening on my family's private yacht, the Aegean Crown, a 200-foot masterpiece of Italian engineering that cost more than most people make in 10 lifetimes. The deck was filled with my usual crowd, the sons and daughters of Greece's elite. All of us, golden tanned and drunk on champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's monthly salary. The music was pounding, some expensive DJ we'd flown in from Ibiza, and the Mediterranean stretched endlessly around us like a blue silk carpet dotted with the lights of other luxury yachts. I was standing at the bow, wearing a white linen shirt that probably cost more than a car, feeling the warm wind whip through my dark hair, when my best friend, Nikos Papadakis, stumbled over with that troublemaker grin I knew meant danger. "Lysander, my brother," he slurred, his designer sunglasses sliding down his nose despite the fact that the sun had set an hour ago. "We need to settle something once and for all." Nikos was old money, just like me. His family owned half the shipping lanes in the Mediterranean. We'd grown up together in the same exclusive circles, attended the same Swiss boarding schools, shared the same assumption that the world existed for our entertainment. He was holding a crystal glass of Dom Perignon that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. "What's eating at you now?" I laughed, taking a swig from my own glass. The champagne tasted like liquid gold, crisp and perfect, just like everything else in my life. "You always claim you're irresistible to women," Nikos said, his voice carrying that edge it got when he was about to propose something spectacular stupid. "But I think it's just your money they want. Strip away the Kalogeris name, the yachts, the hotels, and you're just another pretty face." Our other friend, Dimitri Alexopoulos, materialized beside us like a shark sensing blood in the water. Dimitri was the cynical one in our group, always ready to stir up trouble with that cold smile of his. His family controlled most of the luxury real estate development in the Greek islands. "Oh, this is getting interesting," Dimitri drawled, his pale eyes glinting with malicious amusement. "Are you actually challenging the great Lysander Kalogeris?" I felt my ego bristle. "You have to understand, I'd never been challenged like this before. In my world, I was treated like royalty from the moment I could walk. Private jets, 5-star, everything, women throwing themselves at me wherever I went. It was all I'd ever known. The idea that someone would question my natural charm felt like a personal attack. "You think money is the only reason women want me?" I shot back, probably louder than necessary. The other guests were starting to notice our conversation, turning away from their own champagne-fueled discussions. "Prove it then," Nikos grinned, and I could see the wheels turning in his devious mind. "I bet you 100,000 euros that you can't make any woman fall in love with you without using your wealth or family name." The party seemed to pause around us. 100,000 euros was pocket change to any of us, but it was the principle of the thing. In our circle, backing down from a challenge like this was social suicide. "Any woman?" I asked, my competitive instincts kicking in. I'd never lost a bet in my life, never failed at anything I set my mind to. "We choose," Dmitri added with that predatory smile. "Someone completely outside your usual type. Someone who won't be impressed by designer clothes or expensive cars." Should have walked away. If you've ever made a decision you knew would change everything, you know that feeling in your gut that screams at you to stop. But pride is a dangerous thing when you've never faced real consequences for your actions. "You're on," I said, extending my hand to shake on it. "Choose your victim." The word victim came out so casually, so carelessly. I had no idea how prophetic it would turn out to be, though not in the way I expected. Nikos and Dmitri exchanged glances, and I could see they'd already planned this. They led me to the yacht's expansive main deck, where the staff was quietly cleaning up after our excess, collecting empty champagne flutes, wiping down surfaces, preparing everything for tomorrow's inevitable repeat performance. Dmitri pointed with his champagne glass toward the far corner of the deck. I followed his gaze and saw her for the first time. Melania was crouched down, carefully collecting scattered rose petals that had fallen from the evening's elaborate floral arrangements. She was wearing a simple white uniform, the standard outfit for our household staff, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She couldn't have been more than 24, with olive skin that spoke of long hours working under the Mediterranean sun. She was beautiful, but it wasn't the polished, artificial beauty of the women in my usual social circle. There was something real about her, something authentic that made her stand out against the backdrop of excess and pretense that surrounded my life. She moved with quiet efficiency, like someone who had learned to be invisible in the presence of people like us. "The maid?" I asked, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. "Melania Stavros," Nikos said, clearly pleased with himself. "She's been working for your family for what, 2 years now? I bet you've never even noticed her before tonight." He was right. In my world, the staff were essentially furniture, present when needed, invisible when not. I prided myself on knowing the names of every important person on the island, but I couldn't tell you the first thing about the woman who cleaned my family's home. "She's perfect," Dmitri added with cruel satisfaction. "Working class, probably never owned anything that cost more than 50 euros. And definitely not the type to be impressed by your usual tricks." I watched Melania work, noting the way she moved with quiet dignity despite performing what most people would consider menial labor. She looked up for just a moment, maybe sensing she was being watched, and our eyes met across the crowded deck. There was something in her gaze, not the starstruck awe I was used to from women, but something harder to read. Intelligence, maybe, or wariness. 6 months, I said, my decision made. 6 months to make her fall in love with me, and I keep it completely separate from money and family influence. Deal Nikos grinned, extending his hand. But we want proof. Real proof that she's genuinely fallen for Lysander the man, not Lysander the heir. We shook hands as the yacht rocked gently on the evening swells, the lights of Mykonos twinkling in the distance like fallen stars. The DJ was playing something slow and expensive, and the other guests had returned to their champagne and gossip, unaware that we'd just set in motion something that would destroy everything. I thought I knew about myself as I watched Melania disappear below deck with her cleaning supplies. I felt that familiar thrill of a new challenge. I'd conquered everything else in my life: business deals, extreme sports, any woman I'd ever wanted. How hard could it be to win over one simple maid? I had no idea that Melania Stavros was anything but simple, and that she'd been watching me far longer than I'd been watching her. If you've ever underestimated someone based on their job or social status, you'll understand what happened next. Because sometimes the people we think have the least power are actually the ones holding all the cards. And sometimes the games we think we're playing are completely different from the ones actually being played. The next morning would begin my campaign to win her heart, never suspecting that she already knew exactly who I was and what my family had done to hers. But that's a story that gets much darker before it gets better. The morning after the bet, I woke up in my family's villa with the kind of hangover that only comes from mixing expensive champagne with dangerous decisions. The Mediterranean sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my bedroom, illuminating the marble floors and designer furniture that had been my world since birth. But for the first time in my life, I had a mission that didn't involve simply existing in luxury. I found myself actually paying attention to the staff for the first time ever. Our family villa was a sprawling white stone masterpiece perched on the cliffs overlooking the Aegean Sea, with manicured gardens that required an army of workers to maintain. I'd walked these halls for 28 years without truly seeing the people who made my comfortable life possible. Melania was in the main salon, carefully dusting the collection of ancient Greek artifacts my father had acquired over the years. Some legally, I assumed, though with my father you could never be entirely sure. She moved with the same quiet efficiency I'd noticed the night before, treating each piece like it mattered, even though she probably earned less in a year than I spent on a weekend in Monaco. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound casual as I entered the room. She looked up, and I caught that same unreadable expression I'd seen the night before. Up close, she was even more striking than I'd realized. Her dark eyes held depths that seemed far older than her years, and there was something in the way she carried herself that spoke of inner strength. "Good morning, Mr. Kalogeris," she replied. In accented English, her voice soft but clear, she immediately returned to her work, as if dismissing me. I wasn't used to being dismissed by anyone, especially not by someone in my family's employ. It was intriguing and frustrating at the same time. "Please, call me Lysander," I said, moving closer. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm embarrassed to admit I don't know much about the people who work so hard to maintain our home." She paused in her dusting, studying my face with those intelligent dark eyes. "I am Melania Stavros," she said simply. "I have worked here for 2 years. 2 years. She'd been invisible to me for 2 entire years, cleaning around me, probably listening to my phone calls. witnessing my lifestyle of excess and privilege. The thought should have bothered me, but instead it felt like an interesting challenge. "Where are you from originally?" I asked, genuinely curious for perhaps the first time in my life about someone outside my social circle. "Here, from Mykonos," she answered, but something flickered in her expression. "I live with my Aunt Sophia in the old town." Sophia, I knew that name. She was our head cook, a woman who'd been with our family for years, known for her incredible traditional Greek dishes and her tendency to treat everyone, including my parents, like they were still children in need of feeding. "Sophia Stavros is your aunt?" I asked, and Melania nodded. "She makes the best moussaka I've ever tasted." For the first time, I saw something that might have been a smile touch the corners of her mouth. "She taught me to cook when I was very young, before." She paused, and that shadow crossed her face again. "Before I came to live with her." I wanted to ask more, but she'd already turned back to her work, creating that invisible barrier that separated my world from hers. It was a barrier I'd never noticed before, but now it felt like the most important wall I'd ever tried to break down. Over the next few days, I developed what I thought was a clever strategy. I started appearing wherever Melania was working, always, with some excuse. If she was cleaning the library, I suddenly needed to find a particular book. If she was tending to the gardens, I had urgent business on the terrace. Each time, I tried to engage her in conversation, to chip away at that professional distance she maintained. "You know," I said one afternoon, as she was arranging fresh flowers in the main hall, "I've never really appreciated how beautiful these arrangements are. Do you choose the flowers yourself?" She looked up from the white roses and lavender she was arranging, her hands gentle and precise. "Your mother chooses them. I simply arrange them as she prefers. But you have your own preferences." "Surely," I pressed. "If you could choose any flowers, what would they be?" She was quiet for so long I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, "Wildflowers. The ones that grow on the hillsides. The ones that don't need anyone to take care of them." There was something in the way she said it that made me think she wasn't just talking about flowers. Have you ever met someone who made you suddenly see your own life differently? Because that's what was happening to me. Though I was too proud to admit it at the time, I began bringing her small gifts, nothing too expensive that would violate the terms of my bet, but thoughtful things. A book of Greek poetry I found in our library, written in both Greek and English. A small, potted plant of wild thyme from the hillside she'd mentioned. Each time, she accepted them with polite thanks, but without the enthusiasm I was expecting. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. One evening, as I found her finishing her work in the kitchen, the sun was setting through the windows, casting golden light across the stone counters where Sophia had been preparing dinner. It was a direct question that caught me off guard. In my world, people rarely questioned my motives so bluntly. I realized, "I don't know anything about the people who work so hard for my family," I said, which was partly true. "I want to change that." She studied my face for a long moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through me. "And why do you want to change that now?" I didn't have a good answer that didn't involve admitting to the bet, so I went with something closer to the truth than I'd planned. "Because I think I've been living my life wrong. Because I think there's more to learn from you than from anyone in my usual circle." Something shifted in her expression then, a tiny crack in that professional armor. "What could you possibly learn from someone like me?" "How to be real," I said, and the words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise her. Later that night, I found myself in our family's wine cellar, a climate-controlled sanctuary filled with bottles worth more than most people's homes. My father, Theodoros, was there selecting something for dinner, his silver hair perfectly styled even at the end of the day. "I've been hearing interesting reports about you," he said, without looking up from a vintage Bordeaux. "Cassandra tells me you've been spending time with the staff." My mother, Cassandra, noticed everything and disapproved of most of it. She ran our household like a military operation, ensuring that the proper social distances were maintained at all times. "I'm trying to be more appreciative of their work," I said carefully. My father finally looked at me, his pale blue eyes sharp and calculating. "Appreciation is fine, Lysander, but remember who you are. Remember what we've built and what it takes to maintain it. Some boundaries exist for good reasons." There was something in his tone that felt like a warning, though I couldn't understand why. At the time, I thought he was just being his usual, controlling self, concerned about maintaining the family image. "Of course, Father, I'm not forgetting who I am." But that was exactly what was happening, though I wouldn't realize it for weeks to come. Each conversation with Melania was changing something fundamental about how I saw the world. She had this way of talking about life that made my concerns about yacht parties and designer clothes seem absurdly trivial. "Tell me about your dreams," I asked her one afternoon as we walked through the olive groves that bordered our property. I'd convinced her to take a break from her work, claiming I needed to check on something in the gardens. "Dreams are expensive," she said, her voice carrying a sadness that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. "What if money wasn't an issue?" I pressed. "What would you do with your life?" She stopped walking and looked out over the blue expanse of the Aegean, where white-sailed boats dotted the horizon like scattered papers. "I would study, maybe literature or history. I would write about the real Greece, not the one that exists for tourists and rich people. I would tell the stories that get forgotten." "What stories?" "The stories of families like mine. People who built their lives on these islands for generations, only to lose everything when development and tourism changed everything. People who became invisible so that others could live in paradise." There was pain in her voice, old pain that ran deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. I wanted to ask more, but she'd already started walking back toward the villa, that barrier firmly back in place. That night, I found myself lying awake thinking about her words. For the first time in my life, I was genuinely curious about someone else's perspective, someone else's struggles. It should have been a warning sign that this bet was becoming something more complicated than I'd planned. If you've ever found yourself changing because of someone else's influence, you know how subtle it can be at first. You don't realize it's happening until you're already different, until you're seeing the world through their eyes instead of your own. But I was still convinced I was in control, still certain that I was the one doing the seducing. I had no idea that every conversation, every gift, every moment of what I thought was growing intimacy was being carefully observed and catalogued by someone who knew far more about my family than I could have imagined. Because Melanian Stavros wasn't just a maid who'd caught my attention. She was someone with her own agenda, her own reasons for accepting my gifts and answering my questions. And the game we were playing had rules I didn't even know existed yet. 3 weeks into what I still believed was my carefully orchestrated seduction, something unexpected started happening. I was falling into a routine I'd never experienced before. Actually looking forward to conversations with someone who challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. Melania had begun to relax around me, sharing pieces of herself that felt like precious gifts. though I was too arrogant to realize how calculated each revelation might be. We were sitting in the small garden behind the staff quarters one evening, away from the main villa where my parents entertained their usual crowd of politicians and business associates. The sound of their laughter and clinking glasses drifted across the property like echoes from another world. Melania had agreed to share a simple dinner she'd prepared: fresh bread, local cheese, olives from trees that had been growing on the island for centuries. "This tastes better than anything served at the best restaurants in Athens," I said, and I meant it. There was something about the simplicity, the authenticity, that made our usual five-star dining experiences seem hollow and performative. My Aunt Sophia taught me that the best food comes from the heart, not from expensive ingredients, Melania replied, breaking off a piece of bread. "She says you can taste whether someone cooks with love or just with skill." I watched her hands as she spoke, noting the small calluses from years of hard work, the lack of jewelry or manicured nails that I was used to seeing on women. Everything about her was genuine in a way that felt foreign and intoxicating. "Tell me about growing up here," I said, genuinely curious. "What was it like before tourism changed everything?" Her expression grew distant, and I saw that shadow cross her face again, the one that appeared whenever our conversations touched on the past. It was different. Families had been here for generations, making their living from the sea, from the land. Everyone knew everyone. Children grew up swimming in coves that are now private beaches for luxury hotels. "That sounds idyllic," I said, though something in her tone suggested it wasn't entirely a happy memory. "It was, until the developers came," she said quietly. "Until families who had lived here for centuries were forced to sell their land for a fraction of what it was worth, or had it taken from them through legal manipulation they couldn't afford to fight." There was pain in her voice, old and deep, but also anger carefully controlled. I should have paid more attention to that anger, should have wondered why someone who worked for my family would speak so freely about the very industry that built our fortune. But I was too caught up in the novelty of having a real conversation to notice the warning signs. "That must have been devastating for those families," I said, meaning it more than I'd meant anything in a long time. She looked at me then with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Yes, it was. Some of them never recovered. Some of them disappeared entirely, as if they'd never existed at all." The way she said it sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. Have you ever had someone look at you like they were seeing something you couldn't see yourself? That's what Melania's gaze felt like in that moment. Like she was looking at a different version of me than the one I knew. "I'm sorry that happened," I said, and I was surprised to realize I actually meant it. I never really thought about what it cost to build the world I grew up in. "Most people don't," she replied simply. "It's easier not to think about it." Over the following days, I found myself questioning things I'd never questioned before. When I walked through our hotel properties, I noticed the staff in ways I never had. Their long hours, their careful deference, the way they made themselves invisible around guests. When I heard my parents discussing business deals, I started wondering about the people on the other side of those transactions. "You're becoming quite philosophical lately," my mother, Cassandra, observed one morning over breakfast. She was impeccably dressed as always, her blonde hair perfectly styled, diamond earrings catching the morning light. "Your father says you've been asking unusual questions about our business practices." I was spreading honey on warm bread, a simple pleasure I'd discovered during my conversations with Melania. "I'm just trying to understand how everything works." Shouldn't I know these things if I'm going to inherit the business someday? Of course, darling. But there's a difference between understanding business and developing an inappropriate social conscience, she said with that smile that never quite reached her eyes. Remember, we employ hundreds of people across our properties. We provide jobs, support the local economy. Not everyone can be sentimental about how things used to be. That word sentimental stung more than it should have. It was the same dismissive tone my parents had always used for anything that didn't directly contribute to profit or social status. But now, having heard Melania talk about families losing their ancestral homes, it felt cruel in a way I'd never noticed before. That afternoon, I found Melania in the villa's library, carefully cleaning the leather-bound books that lined the mahogany shelves. The room smelled of old paper and furniture polish, a comforting scent that reminded me of childhood afternoons when this had been my refuge from formal dinners and business meetings. "Do you read much?" I asked, noting how carefully she handled each volume. "When I can," she said, not looking up from her work. "Your family has quite an impressive collection. Feel free to borrow anything that interests you," I said, then immediately felt foolish, as if she needed my permission to read books in a house where she spent more waking hours than I did. She did look up then, and there was something almost amused in her expression. "That's very generous of you." I pulled a book from the shelf, a collection of modern Greek poetry by Odysseus Ilitis. "Have you read this one? He won the Nobel Prize." "Know who Odysseus Ilitis is," she said, and there was the slightest edge to her voice. "I may clean houses for a living, but I'm not uneducated." The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable, and I felt my face burn with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply that you would." She studied my face for a moment, as if trying to decide something. "I actually studied literature before I had to leave university." "You were in university?" The surprise in my voice was probably more obvious than it should have been. "University of Athens. 3 years into a degree in classical literature before family circumstances changed and I could no longer afford to continue." I stared at her, suddenly seeing everything differently. This wasn't just an intelligent woman who happened to work as domestic help. This was someone whose dreams had been derailed by circumstances beyond her control. Someone who could have been sitting in university lectures instead of cleaning my family's home. "What happened?" I asked softly. That shadow crossed her face again, deeper this time. "Life happened. Sometimes you have to choose between your dreams and your survival. I chose survival." The casual way she said it, as if giving up on her education was just another fact of life like the weather, made something twist painfully in my chest. I'd never had to choose between anything. Every door had always been open to me, every opportunity readily available. "You could go back," I said impulsively. "I could help you, provide a scholarship, or no." The word was sharp, final. "I don't need charity, especially not from someone like you. Someone like me." She set down the book she'd been holding and looked directly at me. "Someone who's never had to work for anything in his life. Someone who thinks money can solve every problem because money has solved every problem he's ever had." It should have stung, should have made me defensive. Instead, I found myself admiring her honesty, the way she refused to be impressed by wealth or status. In my world, people told me what they thought I wanted to hear. Melania told me what she thought I needed to hear. "You're right," I admitted. "But that doesn't mean I can't learn to be different." Something flickered in her eyes then. Surprise, maybe, or something that might have been hope. "Why would you want to be different? You have everything anyone could want." Because everything I have feels empty when I'm talking to you, I said. And the honesty of it surprised us both. The silence stretched between us, charged with something I was only beginning to understand. For a moment, I forgot about the bet entirely, forgot about Nikos and Dimitri and the 100,000 euros. All I could think about was how much I wanted this intelligent, complicated woman to see something in me worth caring about. Lysander, she said quietly, and hearing my name on her lips felt like a small miracle. You don't know anything about me. Not really. Then tell me, I said, moving closer. I want to know everything. She was quiet for so long, I thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Some stories are too painful to tell. Some truths are too dangerous to speak. Before I could ask what she meant, we heard footsteps in the hallway. Melania immediately stepped back, her professional mask sliding into place as my Aunt Sophia appeared in the doorway. Sophia was a small, sturdy woman in her late 40s, with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been with our family longer than anyone, and she had a way of looking at people that made them feel like she could see straight through to their souls. Melania, your shift ended an hour ago, she said in Greek, though I understood enough to follow the conversation. You should go home and rest. Of course, Aunt Sophia, Melania replied, gathering her cleaning supplies. But Sophia's eyes were on me, and there was something in her expression that felt like a warning. Mr. Lysander, your mother is looking for you. Something about tomorrow's dinner arrangements. It was clearly a dismissal, and I found myself reluctant to leave. Over the past few weeks, these conversations with Melania had become the highlight of my days. The only time I felt like I was having real experiences instead of just going through the motions of my privileged life. As I walked toward the door, I heard Sophia speaking to Melania in rapid Greek. I only caught fragments, but what I heard made me pause. Be careful. Not what he seems. Remember what happened before. Remember what happened before. The words echoed in my mind as I made my way to find my mother. What was Sophia warning Melania about? And why did she sound so protective, almost fearful? That night, I lay awake thinking about our conversation, about the pain I'd seen in Melania's eyes when she talked about leaving university, about the way she'd said some truths were too dangerous to speak. I was beginning to realize that the woman I'd chosen for my bet was far more complex than I'd imagined, and that there were depths to her story I was only beginning to glimpse. I was also beginning to realize that somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about winning a bet and started being about something much more dangerous. Genuine feelings I wasn't prepared to handle, but I still believed I was in control. Still thought I understood the game we were playing. I had no idea that while I was falling for the intelligent, beautiful woman who challenged everything I thought I knew about the world, she was watching me with the calculating gaze of someone who had been planning this moment far longer than I could have imagined. 4 months into what had started as a cruel bet, I proposed to Melania on a moonlit beach that technically belonged to my family, but felt like it belonged to the stars. The ring was modest by my standards, a simple diamond that cost more than most people's cars, but nothing compared to the jewelry I usually bought for the socialites who flitted through my life. Something told me Melania would appreciate the restraint, the thoughtfulness over ostentation. What I didn't expect was the strange look that crossed her face when I got down on one knee in the sand. The Mediterranean waves whispering against the shore behind us. For just a moment, in the silver moonlight, Her expression wasn't surprise or joy or even confusion. It was something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if she'd been expecting this moment all along. "Lysander," she said softly, her dark eyes reflecting the moonlight as she looked down at me. "Are you sure this is what you want?" It was an odd response to a marriage proposal. Most women, in my experience, would have been overcome with emotion, crying with happiness immediately, calling their friends. But Melania stood there, calm and composed, as if she was giving me one last chance to reconsider. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said, and in that moment, I meant it completely. The bet with Nikos and Dimitri felt like something from another lifetime, a cruel game played by a version of myself I no longer recognized. She was quiet for so long that I started to worry she would say no. Then, slowly, she extended her hand and allowed me to slide the ring onto her finger. "Yes," she said simply, "I'll marry you." I should have been celebrating. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt a strange sense of unease, as if I'd just walked into a trap I couldn't see. But I pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to pre-engagement nerves and the magnitude of what I'd just committed to. When we told my parents the next morning, their reaction was everything I'd expected and worse. My mother Cassandra went completely silent, her coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips, while my father, Theodoros's face, turned a shade of red that suggested dangerously high blood pressure. "You're joking," my mother finally said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Please tell me this is some kind of elaborate prank." "I'm completely serious," I replied, standing a little straighter. "I'm in love with Melania, and I want to marry her." "The maid," my father said flatly, as if stating her profession somehow, explained everything wrong with the situation. "You want to marry our domestic help? Her name is Melania Stavros, and she's one of the most intelligent, genuine people I've ever met," I shot back, surprised by how protective I felt. She was studying literature at the University of Athens before family circumstances forced her to leave. "How romantic," my mother said, with venom dripping from every word. "And what family circumstances would those be? What do you actually know about this girl's background?" It was a fair question, and one that made me realize how much Melania had managed to tell me about herself. While revealing remarkably little concrete information, I knew she was orphaned, that she lived with her Aunt Sophia, that she'd had to leave university for financial reasons. But the details were always vague, always deflected with that sad smile that made me reluctant to push for more. "I know she's had to overcome challenges you and I can't imagine," I said. "I know she's strong and intelligent and kind, and that she sees the world in ways that have made me a better person." My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "Lysander, step outside with me, now," the tone brooked. No argument. I followed him onto the terrace overlooking our private beach, where the morning sun was turning the Aegean into a sheet of molten gold. Under other circumstances, it would have been breathtakingly beautiful. Today, it felt like the backdrop for an execution. "Do you have any idea what you're risking?" my father demanded once we were alone. "Our reputation, our business relationships, our standing in society. Do you think the Papadakis family or the Alexopoulos family will want to associate with people who marry their domestic staff? If they're that shallow, maybe we shouldn't associate with them either," I replied, though even as I said it, I knew how naive it sounded. My father stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. "Shallow, Lysander. These relationships are how we maintain our position, how we continue to grow our wealth. Business is built on trust and social connections. You marry below your class, and suddenly people start questioning everything about our family. What if I don't care about maintaining our position? I asked, surprising myself with the question. For a moment, my father looked genuinely shocked. Then his expression hardened into something cold and calculating that I'd seen before but never directed at me. Then you're not the son I raised, he said quietly. And perhaps you're not suited to inherit what I've built. The threat was unmistakable. For the first time in my life, I was facing the possibility of losing everything I'd always taken for granted. The hotels, the money, the lifestyle, all of it could disappear if I pushed this too far. But as I stood there, looking out at the sea, I realized something had fundamentally changed inside me. The prospect of losing my inheritance didn't terrify me the way it should have. What terrified me was the thought of losing Melania, of going back to the empty, meaningless existence I'd been living before. She opened my eyes to what life could actually be. Then maybe it's time for me to build something of my own, I said. My father's laugh was bitter and humorless. With what? You've never worked a day in your life, never earned €1 that didn't come from the family business. You have no idea what the real world is like. He was right, and we both knew it. But I was too proud and too in love to admit it. The next few weeks were tense to say the least. My mother alternated between icy silence and pointed comments about appropriate matches and social responsibility. My father buried himself in business, though I occasionally caught him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Meanwhile, the wedding preparations took on a surreal quality. My mother insisted on handling everything, claiming she wouldn't have her son married in anything less than perfection, though her tone suggested she was planning a funeral rather than a celebration. The guest list was a who's who of Greek high society, business associates, and politicians, exactly the kind of event I would have expected for a Caligeris wedding. Melania seemed oddly detached from the whole process. When my mother presented fabric samples for her dress, she nodded politely but showed no real enthusiasm. When the florist came to discuss arrangements, she deferred to my mother's choices without expressing any preferences of her own. "Are you okay with all this?" I asked her one evening as we walked through the gardens. "I know it's a lot more elaborate than you probably wanted. It's your family's tradition," she replied diplomatically. "I want to respect that, but there was something in her tone, a careful neutrality that felt rehearsed. I was beginning to notice these small things about her, the way she sometimes seemed to be performing rather than simply being, the way certain questions made her pause just a fraction too long before answering. "Melania," I said, stopping in the middle of the lavender-bordered path, "is there anything you want to tell me? Anything about your past, your family, anything at all?" She turned to face me, and in the fading evening light, her expression was unreadable. "What kind of thing? Do you mean?" "I don't know. Sometimes I feel like there are things you're not saying, like you're holding something back." For a moment, something flickered across her face. Fear, maybe, or calculation. Then she stepped closer and took my hands in hers. "Everyone has secrets, Lysander," she said softly. "Even you, I'm sure. The question is whether those secrets matter more than what we have together." It should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like a warning wrapped in velvet. But I was too deep in love to heed it, too committed to the path I'd chosen to turn back now. 3 days before the wedding, I was in my father's study looking for some documents he'd asked me to find when I discovered something that changed everything. The study was my father's private sanctuary, filled with leather-bound ledgers, framed photographs of business achievements, and filing cabinets that contained decades of family business records. I was searching through a cabinet marked property, acquisitions 1990 to 2000, when I found a file that made my blood run cold. It was labeled Stavros Property, acquisition complete, and dated October 1995. Inside were legal documents, correspondence, and photographs showing a small fishing operation, boats, nets, a modest house overlooking a cove that I now recognized as part of our southernmost hotel property. The final document was a deed transfer showing that Georgios and Alina Stavros had sold their property to Kalogeris Holdings for a fraction of its current value. But it was the handwritten notes in my father's distinctive script that made my hands shake as I read them. Family will not agree to reasonable offer. Legal pressure applied successfully. Local connections utilized to expedite process. Final sale completed under duress. Property cleared for development. Georgios and Alina's. Melania's last name was Stavros. The dates aligned with when she would have been very young, when she'd told me her family circumstances had changed dramatically. I kept digging through the file, finding more documents, more photographs, pictures of my father shaking hands with local officials, records of payments made to expedite permits and bypass environmental regulations, evidence of a coordinated campaign to force a family from land that they'd owned for generations. And then I found the newspaper clipping that stopped my heart completely. It was from a local Mykonos paper, dated 6 months after the property sale. Local fishing family dies in tragic accident. The article described how Georgios and Alina Stavros had been killed when their small fishing boat capsized during a storm. They left behind one daughter, age 14, who had gone to live with relatives. I sat in my father's leather chair, surrounded by evidence of how our family fortune had really been built, and finally understood why Melania had agreed to marry me. This wasn't a love story. This was something much more complex and dangerous. But even as the pieces fell into place, even as I realized I'd been playing a game where I didn't know the rules, I couldn't bring myself to regret falling in love with her. Because, regardless of her motives, regardless of what she might be planning, what I felt for her was real. The question was, what was she planning to do about the family that had destroyed hers? And did I have the courage to find out before it was too late? If you've ever discovered that everything you believed about your life was built on someone else's suffering, you know that feeling of the ground shifting beneath your feet. But sometimes the most dangerous revelations are the ones that force you to choose between the comfortable lies you've always lived with and the painful truth that might set you free. 2 days before our wedding, I still hadn't decided what to do with what I'd learned. But I was about to discover that Melania had been planning this moment far longer than I'd been falling in love with her. The morning of our wedding, I woke up with the documents about the Stavros family burning like acid in my mind. I'd spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, trying to decide whether to confront Melania before the ceremony or wait to see what she had planned. The rational part of me knew I should call everything off, expose whatever game she was playing. But the part of me that had fallen genuinely in love with her couldn't bear the thought of losing her, even if everything between us had been built on lies. I chose cowardice. I chose to walk into that ancient Orthodox church without saying a word about what I'd discovered, telling myself that maybe I was wrong. Maybe the documents didn't mean what I thought they meant. Have you ever made a decision you knew was wrong because the alternative was too painful to face? That's exactly what I did. The church of Panagia Paraportiani was bathed in golden morning light when I arrived, its whitewashed walls glowing against the blue Aegean sky. 300 guests filled the wooden pews, politicians, business magnates, celebrities who'd flown in from across Europe. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense and expensive perfume, creating an almost intoxicating atmosphere that felt both sacred and surreal. My parents sat in the front row. My mother, resplendent in designer black that looked more appropriate for a funeral than a wedding. My father stone-faced in his custom Italian suit. Behind them, I could see Nikos and Dimitri, both grinning with anticipation. They thought they were about to witness my triumph in our bet. They had no idea they were about to see something much more devastating. I stood at the altar in my traditional mourning coat, trying to calm my racing heart as Father Christos Vasilakis prepared for the ceremony. Father Christos was an elderly man who'd known my family for decades, and I could see the discomfort in his weathered face. He'd been pressured into performing this ceremony despite his obvious reservations about the social mismatch. Then the music began, and everything else faded into background noise. Melania appeared at the far end of the church, like a vision from another world. The wedding dress my mother had chosen was traditional Greek Orthodox style, white silk with intricate gold embroidery, a flowing veil that caught the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. But it wasn't the dress that took my breath away. It was the expression on her face. There was no nervousness, no bridal joy, no excitement. Instead, there was a calm determination that made my blood run cold. She walked down the aisle with the measured pace of someone approaching a business meeting rather than her wedding day. Her dark eyes were fixed on mine, and in them I saw something that finally made all the pieces click into place. This wasn't love. This wasn't even revenge in the passionate, emotional sense. This was justice, cold and calculated and years in the making. Dots as she reached the altar and took her place beside me. I caught a subtle scent that wasn't her usual lavender soap. It was something sharper, more expensive. Looking closer, I noticed details I'd somehow missed before. Her makeup was flawless in a way that suggested professional application. Her hair styled with a sophistication that went beyond what our local salon could achieve. Even her posture was different, more confident, as if she'd shed a costume she'd been wearing for months. "Dearly beloved, Father Christos," began in heavily accented English, his voice echoing off the ancient stone walls. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Lysander, Dimitrios, Kalogeris, and Melania Eleni, Stavros, in holy matrimony." The sound of her full name spoken aloud in that sacred space hit me like a physical blow. Stavros, the same name on those property documents, on that newspaper clipping about the tragic accident that had killed her parents. I looked sideways at her, but her expression remained serene, almost peaceful. Father Christos continued with the traditional Orthodox ceremony, speaking of love and commitment and the sacred bonds of marriage, but his words felt like they were coming from very far away. All I could focus on was the woman standing beside me, wondering who she really was beneath the careful performance she'd been giving for months. When the time came for the exchange of rings, Melania's hands were perfectly steady as she slipped the gold band onto my finger. Mine was shaking slightly as I performed the same ritual for her. The symbolism felt heavy with meaning I was only beginning to understand. If anyone here has reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace, Father Christos intoned. though his tone suggested he was merely following ritual rather than expecting any actual objections. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. I found myself almost hoping someone would speak up, would give me an excuse to stop this before it went any further. But 300 guests remained perfectly quiet, waiting for the ceremony to continue. "Very well," Father Christos said, opening his prayer book to the final blessing. "Lysander, do you take Melania to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" "I do," I said, though my voice sounded strange in my own ears. "And Melania, do you take Lysander to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" There was the slightest pause before she answered, barely perceptible but enough to make my heart skip a beat. Then, clearly and calmly, "I do. By the power vested in me by the Greek Orthodox Church and the nation of Greece, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." This was the moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading. As I leaned in to kiss her, Melania rose, slightly on her toes, bringing her lips close to my ear instead. To the congregation, it must have looked like an intimate moment between newlyweds. Only I could hear what she whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible above the rustle of her silk dress. "I know what your father did to my family in 1995. I know how you really got rich." The words hit me like a physical blow, confirming my worst fears and destroying any remaining hope that I'd been wrong about the documents I'd found. But she wasn't finished. "I know about the legal pressure, the bribes to local officials, the way you forced my parents off land that had been in our family for 6 generations. I know about the boat that capsized 6 months later when they were trying to make a living, with equipment they could barely afford because you'd stolen everything they had." My vision started to blur around the edges. The sound of 300 people applauding our kiss seemed to come from another universe. All I could focus on was her voice, calm and precise, destroying my world one whisper at a time. "I know that. My parents died because your family decided their property was worth more than their lives. I know that you've been living off blood money for your entire privileged existence." I tried to pull back, to look at her face, but she maintained that intimate pose, continuing to whisper with the measured cadence of someone who'd rehearsed these words countless times. "And I know that this marriage gives me legal standing too. Challenge every property acquisition your family made during that period. I know that the statute of limitations on fraud and bribery doesn't apply when new evidence comes to light. I know that I've been gathering that evidence for 2 years while you thought I was just your invisible little maid." The wedding bouquet slipped from her hands and hit the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever. White roses and baby's breath scattered across the ancient stones like fallen snow, beautiful and somehow prophetic. "You thought you were playing a game with me," she whispered, her lips still close to my ear. "You thought you were the hunter and I was the prey. But I've been hunting your family since I was 14 years old, and today is the day I finally caught you." When she finally pulled back, the transformation was complete. The shy, deferential maid was gone, replaced by someone whose eyes burned with intelligence and purpose. She was still beautiful, still the woman I'd fallen in love with. But now I could see the steel beneath the softness, the calculation behind every smile she'd given me. "Smile," she said quietly, though her own expression remained perfectly composed. "We have 300 witnesses watching us, and several photographers from society magazines. This is supposed to be the happiest day of your life." I tried to follow her instruction, tried to paste on the expression of a happy groom, but I felt like I was drowning in plain sight. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, my relationship with this woman, all of it was crumbling around me, while cameras flashed and people cheered as we turned to face the congregation for the recessional. I caught sight of my parents in the front row. My father's face had gone completely white, as if he'd somehow heard what Melania had whispered to me. My mother looked confused, but was maintaining her social smile for the cameras. Behind them, Nikos and Dimitri were grinning and raising champagne glasses, still thinking they were witnessing my victory in our cruel bet. None of them understood that the real game had been played by someone else entirely. Someone who'd been planning this moment since she was an orphaned teenager with nothing left to lose except her hunger for justice. As we walked down the aisle together, Melania's hand resting lightly on my arm, I realized that everything I'd thought about power and control had been an illusion. The woman walking beside me had just destroyed my world with a few whispered words, and she'd done it while wearing the wedding dress my mother had chosen, in front of everyone who mattered in our social circle. If you've ever realized that you were never actually in control of your own life, that you were just a player in someone else's much larger game, you know that feeling of vertigo that comes with understanding how blind you've been. But sometimes the most devastating revelations are also the most liberating, because they force you to confront who you really are beneath all the lies you've been telling yourself. Walking out of that church as a married man, I knew that my old life was over. The question was whether I had the courage to help Melania destroy the empire built on her family's suffering, or whether I would try to protect the blood money that had given me everything I'd ever known. But first, I had to survive the reception, where 300 guests were waiting to congratulate us on our perfect fairy tale wedding. The reception at our family's flagship hotel should have been the social event of the season. The grand ballroom overlooked the Aegean Sea. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across marble floors, and tables groaned under the weight of caviar, champagne, and delicacies flown in from across Europe. 300 guests mingled and laughed, completely unaware that the bride had just detonated a bomb that would level everything they thought they knew about the Kalogeris family. I moved through the crowd like a sleepwalker, shaking hands and accepting congratulations, while words echoed in my mind like a death sentence. She stayed by my side, playing the perfect bride, smiling graciously at compliments about her dress, thanking guests for their attendance. To anyone watching, we looked like the picture of newlywed bliss. "Magnificent ceremony," said Minister Alexakis, a government official whose pockets my father had been lining for years. "Your father must be so proud to see the family name continuing with such elegance." "Yes," I managed to reply, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. So proud, Melania's hand rested lightly on my arm, but I could feel the tension in her fingers, the coiled energy of someone who'd just accomplished the first phase of a long-planned mission. When she looked at me, her dark eyes held a mixture of satisfaction and something that might have been pity. "Are you feeling all right, darling?" she had asked with perfect wifely concern as another group of well-wishers moved away. "You look a bit pale." "I need some air," I said quietly. "And I think we need to talk, of course. But first, there's someone I'd like you to meet properly." She led me across the ballroom to where Sophia stood near the kitchen entrance, no longer wearing her usual servant's uniform, but dressed in an elegant black dress that transformed her from staff into someone who clearly belonged among the guests. The change was so dramatic that several people had done double takes as she passed. "Lysander," Melania said with formal politeness, "I'd like you to meet my aunt, Sophia Stavros, though I believe you know her better as your family's head cook." Sophia's eyes, so much like Melanian's, studied my face with an intensity that made me feel like an insect under a microscope. "Mr. Caligaris," she said in careful English, "congratulations on your marriage to my niece." "Thank you," I replied automatically, though the word felt like ash in my mouth. "Sophia has been watching over me for many years," Melania continued, her voice carrying layers of meaning. "She's been particularly helpful in preserving family history, making sure important documents and photographs don't get lost." The implication was unmistakable. Whatever evidence Melania had against my family, Sophia had been helping her collect it. For how long? 2 years. Longer. I thought about all the family dinners Sophia had served, all the private conversations she'd overheard, all the documents she might have photographed while cleaning my father's study. "I should check on the kitchen," Sophia said with a slight smile. "Make sure everything is running smoothly for such an important celebration." She squeezed Melanian's hand briefly before disappearing into the crowd. "How long?" I asked Melanian, once we were alone again. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since I was 14 years old and attending my parents' funeral," she replied simply, though the specific plan has evolved over the years. Before I could respond, my father appeared. At my elbow, his face flushed with champagne and what I now recognized as barely controlled panic. "Lysander, I need to speak with you, privately now." The urgency in his tone cut through the celebration noise. I looked at Melania, who nodded graciously. "Of course, I'll entertain our guests until you return." My father practically dragged me to his private office on the hotel's top floor, slamming the door behind us and immediately pouring himself a large whiskey despite the early hour. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he demanded, his usually perfect composure cracking completely. "Do you understand what that woman is capable of?" "Tell me," I said, settling into one of his leather chairs. "Tell me about the Stavros family, property. Tell me about 1995. His face went completely white. For a moment, he looked older than his 58 years, fragile in a way I'd never seen before. "How do you know about that?" "I found the files. I read everything. I watched him carefully. Tell me it's not true. Tell me we didn't destroy that family." He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It was business, Lysander. Just business. We needed that land for the southern development, and they refused every reasonable offer." Reasonable, the word came out sharper than I intended. "You forced them off land their family had owned for generations. You bribed officials, applied illegal pressure, destroyed their livelihood." "We followed all legal procedures," he said defensively, but there was no conviction in his voice. "And when they died 6 months later, when their boat capsized because they couldn't afford proper equipment, was that just business too?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Outside the windows, the Aegean sparkled in the afternoon sun, beautiful and indifferent to human suffering. "They were going to destroy everything we'd built," he said finally. "One family's sentimental attachment to a piece of land versus hundreds of jobs, millions in economic development. I made a hard choice. You made a choice that killed 2 people and orphaned their daughter. And now that daughter has married into our family," he said, his business mind finally catching up to the implications, "which gives her legal standing to challenge every acquisition we made during that period." If she has evidence of impropriety, she has evidence. She's had people helping her collect it for years. He sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his years. What does she want? It was a good question, and one I wasn't sure I could answer. What did someone want when they'd dedicated half their life to bringing down the family that destroyed theirs? I think, I said slowly, she wants justice. Justice. He laughed bitterly. Justice would destroy everything we've built. Our hotels, our investments, our reputation, it would all be gone. And for what? You can't bring her parents back. No, but you can acknowledge what you did to them. You can make amends to the other families you displaced. You can stop pretending that our wealth came from anything other than other people's suffering. He stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. You're talking about giving up everything that makes us who we are. Maybe who we are isn't worth keeping. The words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise him. But sitting there in his opulent office, surrounded by the trappings of wealth built on other people's misery, I realized something fundamental had changed inside me over the past few months. Melania hadn't just opened my eyes to a different way of seeing the world, she'd shown me what it meant to have principles worth fighting for. She could have destroyed us quietly, I continued, thinking out loud. Taken the evidence to prosecutors, brought civil suits, ruined us in the media. But she married me first. Why? The answer came to me even as I asked the question. Because she wanted to give me a choice. She wanted to see if I was capable of being different from my father. If I could choose justice over comfort, truth over profitable lies. When I returned to the reception, the party was in full swing. Guests were dancing to a string quartet. Champagne was flowing freely. And the elaborate 5-tier wedding cake was being ceremonially cut by a photographer who'd flown in from Paris. Just for this moment, Melania was standing on the terrace overlooking the sea, her wedding dress flowing in the evening breeze. She looked like a Greek goddess contemplating the fate of mortals, beautiful and terrible and absolutely in control. Have you made your decision? She asked, without turning around as I approached. What decision? Whether you're going to try to protect your family's empire or help me tear it down. I stood beside her, looking out at the water where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. What happens if I choose to help you? Justice happens. The families your father displaced get compensation. The officials he bribed get exposed. The environmental damage gets acknowledged and addressed. Your family loses most of its wealth, but keeps its freedom. And if I choose to protect them, then I proceed alone, and the justice is much less merciful. She finally turned to look at me, and in the fading light, her expression was almost gentle. I know this isn't easy for you. Despite everything, I believe you're a good person who was raised in a terrible system. You have a chance to be different from your father. And what about us? I asked. What about what I feel for you? What you feel for me is real, she said softly. And what I came to feel for you over these months was real too, though it wasn't part of my original plan. But feelings can't exist in a foundation built on lies and blood money. She was right. And we both knew it. Any relationship built on the suffering my family had caused would be poisoned from the start. I'll help you, I said, the words coming easier than I'd expected. I'll testify about what I found in my father's files. I'll help expose everything, for the first time since our wedding ceremony. She smiled, not the careful, calculated expression she'd been wearing all day, but something genuine and warm. Thank you, she said simply. 6 months later, I was living in a small apartment in Athens, working as a junior associate at a legal aid clinic that helped families fight corporate land grabs. The Caligeris hotel empire had collapsed in spectacular fashion when Melanian's evidence came to light, triggering investigations that exposed decades of corruption and illegal business practices. My father was facing criminal charges, my mother had fled to Switzerland, and our family name had become synonymous with greed and exploitation. I should have been miserable. I'd lost everything I'd grown up believing defined me: the money, the status, the easy life of privilege. Instead, I felt more alive than I ever had before. Melania and I had divorced quietly after the trials ended, both of us recognizing that our relationship had served its purpose. She'd gotten her justice, and I'd gotten my soul back. She was studying law now, using the compensation money from our family's assets to finish her education and help other victims of corporate abuse. Sometimes I saw her around Athens, usually in courthouses or at legal aid offices. We'd nod politely, like friendly acquaintances rather than former spouses who'd destroyed an empire together. There was no bitterness between us, just the quiet recognition that we'd each gotten what we needed from our strange, complicated marriage. If you've ever lost everything and discovered that you're still yourself underneath all the things you thought defined you, you know how liberating that can be. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are actually the ones who save us. And sometimes justice looks like love until you realize that love looks like letting someone go. I never regretted falling for Melania's DeRose, and I never regretted helping her bring down my family's corrupt empire. Because sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is help them destroy everything you used to be, so you can become someone worthy of the person they helped you become. That's my story. That's how I learned that real wealth isn't about what you own, but about who you're brave enough to become when everything else is stripped away. And that's how a maid taught a rich god what it really means to be human.
Like stars into the sky, like ocean